Museum by the Christie statue. Tack för uppmärksamheten. Thank you for your attention.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is truly fantastic to see a packed university aula today in honor of our laureate, Professor Achille Mbembe. Welcome, everyone, and also to those of you following this on live stream. My name is Bjørn Enge Bertelsen, and I am the academic director of the Holberg Prize. It is truly a great honor and a pleasure for me to introduce to you this year's Holberg laureate, Professor Achille Mbembe. Born in 1957, Achille Mbembe is research professor of history and politics at the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research, otherwise known as WISER, at the University of the Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, South Africa. He is also the director of the Innovation Foundation for Democracy. Educated in Cameroon and France, Mbembe earned his PhD in history from the Université Paris I, Sorbonne, and a diplôme d'études approfondies from the Institut d'études politiques de Paris. Professor Mbembe has taught at various universities in the United States, including Columbia University, the University of Pennsylvania, the University of California at Berkeley and at Irvine, Yale University, Duke University, and Harvard University. A recipient of the Ernst Bloch Award, he's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a fellow of the British Academy. Mbembe holds honorary doctorates from the Paris 8 University, the Catholic University of Louvain, and the University of Bergen. His work has been translated into, by now, 18 languages across the globe, and increasing. The Holberg Committee highlights that Mbembe is recognized as one of the foremost thinkers of post-colonial Africa, and he is a leading critical theorist of the planetary. He has significantly advanced the understanding of racism and its effects on subjectivity, particularly through the concept of the racial subject. Mbembe's rejection of all forms of racism is also inspired by the uneven impact of the climate crisis on the global south, a theme explored in his recent work, Brutalism, from 2024. Mbembe's early work focused on colonial violence, African resistance, and struggles for independence. His work analyzed the nature of state power and led him to rethink the notion of the post-colony. His key books, many of which have been translated from French, include On the Post-Colony from 2001, Necropolitics from 2019, Out of the Dark Night from 2021, Brutalism from 2024, and The Earthly Community, Reflections on the Last Utopia from 2022. These works cover a broad range of themes, including the contradictions inherent in democracy, race, ethnicity, biopolitics, and identity politics within African states. The committee emphasizes the importance of Mbembe's groundbreaking work, Critique of Black Reason, from 2017, a philosophical study of the historical emergence and meaning of blackness. It examines how the term black was used to dehumanize individuals in the interests of capital, showing how blackness was associated with being human, being non-human or animal-like, thereby justifying the reproduction of oppressive and exploitative structures. Mbembe argues that some black critiques of race have implicitly reproduced the epistemology of racial difference. Recently, Mbembe's focus has shifted to contemporary developments in the colonial imperial world, the nature of late Eurocentrism, the impact of the Anthropocene, and the implications of artificial intelligence for humanity. The committee concludes that Mbembe's oeuvre goes beyond a particular notion of decolonization to a universalist recentering of the human. This involves a commitment to facing historical truth and fostering learning and remembering across South-North divides. By any standard, Professor Achille Mbembe's achievements are truly remarkable. The enticing title of Professor Mbembe's Holberg lecture is The Earthly Community. Achille Mbembe, welcome once more, and the floor is yours.
I have the feeling of being a witness either to my own funeral or even more joyfully to my wedding. A wedding, obviously, with Holberg. I would like to thank the rector, who is with us, who has been with us, in fact, since we came here. The chairperson of the Holberg committee, members of the committee, as well as my dear friend Bjorn. I thought I should share with you some of the questions which have been at the core of whatever I have written over the last 3.5 decades. I'm not going to provide you with a summary of the work I have done. Rather, I will offer a set of footnotes and rejoinders as I look back to an itinerary whose shape and contours I could not have predicted. Must I add that the little I have achieved, I owe to an innumerable list of friends turned teachers and teachers turned friends, as well as to the love of and dedication of my family. And I see in particular Anil and Leah and Sarah sitting right there. The concerns I have wrestled with are now pretty well documented. They have appeared at various moments under various notions in my writings. Bjorn cited some of them: On the Post-Colony, Out of the Dark Night, Critique of Black Reason, Necropolitics, Brutalism, or more recently, The Earthly Community. They can also be found in a substantial body of public interventions in newspaper articles, TV and radio interviews, contributions to magazines or exhibition catalogues. Looking back at the total sum of this work, I now realize the extent to which, even when the past and the present were the direct objects of my gaze, the extent to which the future is all I truly ever cared about. The futures of life, the futures of reason, and the futures of the earth. As many of you may know, I was born in Cameroon. I left and went to study in Paris in my early years, early 20s, And growing up as a young person in Cameroon, I was exposed to various aspects of local cultural traditions and conventions. I also witnessed in situ the many ways in which pre-colonial beliefs and symbolic systems had survived the colonial encroachment or been transformed by it. For instance, in local systems of meaning, the theme of human uniqueness and exceptionalism, which is the cornerstone of Western philosophy, was a matter neither of theoretical debate nor of practical concern. Indeed, here, as well as in numerous African systems of thought, as I was to discover later, it was simply taken for granted that each living being came into being through its relations with its environment and the creatures with whom it shared that environment. To put it succinctly, being with others preceded being in and of itself. Relation preceded ontology. In contrast to the disinterest in the uniqueness of the human, an extraordinary emphasis was placed on the diverse ways of becoming a human person and on the infrastructures or sources of empowerment required to sustain what was known where I grew up as full personhood. In any case, humans as persons among other persons, or as persons of a distinctive kind, represented a paradox in the sense that individual identity was always more than and less than it appeared to be. As argued by one of my late teachers, anthropologist Jane Geyer, in a study on wealth in people and wealth in things, personal abilities existed first. In any case, it was understood that they existed first. Then they could be augmented, conserved, and actualized within the person, making that person a real person or a full person, singular to themselves and recognized as such by the community. To the point where the social process was about putting these singularities together and sharing these singularities. It was never about identity, in any case, in the sense in which many understand it nowadays. A direct consequence of the primacy of mutuality over ontology, of singularity over identity, of becoming over being, the constitutive entanglement between human persons, animal persons, material and technical artifacts, and other entities was never in doubt. In fact, and not only for purposes of efficacy, a full person endowed with power was one who knew how to assemble and to activate diverse materials and their properties. He or she could then draw on in-depth knowledge, knowledge of the forests, knowledge of the night world or of the occult, knowledge of various earths, soils, plants, animals, insects, to unite vital forces which at first sight seemed to be opposed. Through this process of activation by assemblage, activation by knotting, activation by twisting and binding, through this proficiency in communicating with the non-person's worlds, he or she could defend himself or herself against the ever-present threat of enemy attack. He or she could influence other persons and things and make them act. He or she could even exchange death with life. While fulfilling all along protective, restorative, and therapeutic functions. This is perhaps the reason why, so it was believed, human persons could escape the limits of their biological bodies or augment it, or even trick death into leaving them alone and rather taking another person in one's place. So as a young person, I occasionally attended traditional ceremonies, listening to elders being told about the healers and the diviners. I had a grandmother who was a diviner and a healer, or being introduced to ancestral myths. And in the process, I early on learned about the existence of malevolent forces as well as divinatory insight and other forms of specialized knowledges whose aim was to promote the health and welfare of individuals and communities. I also learned about the world of objects, especially those which could be or were indeed the source and instruments of various forms of empowerment. And through such objects, power and body, body and psyche, psyche and the imagination and the world of dreams, all of these could find expression. I saw the extent through such objects, the extent to which these objects could be constructed out of a wide range of organic materials and substances. It wasn't never always wood, for instance, when it comes to sculptures. It was always wood to which were added many other different sub-objects, components, substances, powder, fire, etc. This is probably how, gradually, I started paying attention to the mysterious forces and powers that govern the world and human lives, but I started paying attention more generally to all things that, in one way or another, come from the earth. And in the milieu in which I grew up, the genuine interest in earthly matters was not only justified by the strongly held belief in the omnipresence of danger and the ever-ending need for material, spiritual, and psychological security. It proceeded too from the deep conviction expressed in myths, rituals, and legends that human beings were part of a very deep history that was older than the existence of the human race as such. So this history of entanglement with multiple other species required that the reality of objects be rethought beyond human meanings and uses, in their thingness and in their animate materiality. Matter, on the other hand, was not an inert receptacle of forms that came from outside. To be a full human person was not necessarily to act autonomously, but to know how to share agency with every non-human entity, each time with the goal of creating and sustaining a milieu for life. My apprenticeship of these ways of becoming human, of being born to the human, these ways of inhabiting and narrating the world, did not last long. Nor was this apprenticeship ever completed. But when I left Cameroon in 1982, I took shades of these conceptual schemas, these images of thought, these poetic and even oniric structures. I took them with me, and one can see them re-emerging with force, for instance, in my latest book, The Earthly Community, which Bjorn alluded to a moment ago. That's the first set of footnotes I wanted to share with you. And now move to the second set of footnotes, which begin with the moment when I arrived in South Africa. I arrived in South Africa in 2001, at a time of relative political and intellectual ferment. In the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, major debates in critical theory were concerned, amongst others, with the old concept of the human, and many were wondering whether this concept could still be reanimated, especially in view of new discoveries in domains such as neuroscience and genetic research. This debate on the human was taking on a paradoxical resonance in South Africa. With the end of apartheid, South Africa was searching for the kind of affirmative politics which entailed the production of social horizons of hope, in lieu of the politics of deliberate cruelty and destruction of the years of racial segregation and disjunctive inclusion. To reconstruct what centuries of brutality had destroyed, required the mobilization of new creative resources and a new imaginary. Critical humanism, a term we borrowed from the work of Paul Gilroy, critical humanism in this context would have meant a persistent commitment to the possibilities and powers of life, itself a precondition for the reconstitution of the human in politics and culture. Indeed, during the first decade of democracy, South Africa undertook to dismantle a racial mode of rule inherited from the apartheid era. This required to strike down white supremacist-based frameworks of citizenship. It required the abolition of inhumane laws. It required also striving to create equality through positive state action. The post-apartheid state aimed to achieve justice through reconciliation as opposed to vengeance and retribution. It aimed to achieve equality through economic redress as opposed, for instance, to expropriation and outright nationalization. It aimed to achieve democracy through the transformation of the law and the restoration of a variety of rights, including the right to dignity. This normative project was enshrined in a utopian constitution which was underlined by the principle of Ubuntu, or human mutuality. It was understood that freedom was indivisible. There couldn't be freedom for whites separate from freedom for blacks. For freedom to be absolute, as Archbishop Desmond Tutu writes in one of his books, it had to, quote him, to be shared as equally as possible among the different constituents of this new nation. Today, this seems so long ago. It seems so long ago, partly because, sadly, apartheid has survived South Africa. So my book, Critique of Black Reason, is wrestling with some of these issues. It is not a book about South Africa as such. It is preoccupied with the place of race in capitalism, as well as capitalism's intrinsic capacity to convert certain forms of the human not only into commodities as during the Atlantic slavery period, but into waste. To some extent, capitalism is the only religion without taboos humans have ever invented. One such taboo would be the idea that, endowed with an innate capacity for self-recognition, a human person is not a thing. Indeed, the idea that personhood is the antithesis of thinghood is central to the modern project of human emancipation and to our understanding of what alienation is all about. And countless historical struggles have taken place whose aim was to make sure that human persons were not turned into mere objects and that they be counted as human persons. Invoking waste in the book, I was trying to draw attention to what has historically happened at the intersection of race and market mechanisms, especially when the latter have not only been used to sort between productive and unproductive lives, but also to target such presumably unproductive lives as objects of abjection or as killable objects. And in relation to black persons, this logic of disposability has been typical of the rule of capital and a key feature of the brutality of the market order. This explains the manufacturing at a mass scale of surplus populations that have often been separated partially or fully, either from domains of capitalist exchange or from the key domains of common life. Critique of black reason tries to capture these dialectics of indispensability and expendability. When the book was published, new ways of converting entire racial classes into waste were in full swing as a result of important shifts in the way neoliberalism operates. Indeed, in many places in the African continent, we were witnessing the proliferation of extractive enclaves and the generalization of predatory modes of wealth capture and accumulation. And where access to wage labor was still a remote possibility, accumulation was more and more embedded in a logic of disposability. And this trend only intensified since the book was published in 2013. Crucially, we are now starting to witness a relocation of value extraction to digital platforms. As algorithmic forms of intelligence develop very often, in fact, in parallel or even in alliance with genetic research, the integration of algorithms and big data analysis in the biological sphere brings with it greater and greater belief in techno-positivism, in the sense that statistical thinking or regimes for assessing the natural world, the corresponding modes of prediction and analysis, all of this now tends to treat matter, the earth and life itself, as computable objects. Now, the idea that life might be an open, a non-linear, and exponentially chaotic force, or to use a term we use a lot yesterday, energy, this idea is increasingly dismissed. And we seem to have reached the point where the market is envisaged as the only mechanism for the production and validation of truth. Now, all of the texts I have authored, of all of them, none has equaled the global resonance achieved by the concept of necropolitics, of which I would like to say one or two things before I conclude. This concept was born out of the attempt to reframe debates on sovereignty, which were raging in the field of political philosophy and international relations in the aftermath of 9/11 and the so-called War on Terror. This was also a moment when some of the first sustained political critiques of neoliberalism were being mounted. It was then claimed, for instance, that one of the lasting effects of neoliberalism was the hollowing out of liberal democracy. Striking to me was the way in which, in fact, the political, including within liberal democracies, was being recast as nothing but another figure of war making. A war without laws and a war without end, a war opposing visceral enemies one could not reason with, negotiate with, but should eviscerate. Such ways of envisioning the political as nothing but an endless struggle to death against visceral enemies, stripped of their human essence. Such ways of envisioning the political had an antecedence both in the Atlantic slavery paradigm and in late modern colonialism. They had been at work, for instance, during colonial wars of conquest and dispossession in South Africa in the 19th century, and during counter-insurrectional wars in Algeria, in Vietnam, and other parts of the world. When one looks at carefully at the Atlantic slavery paradigm, it is easy to discover the extent to which death in that paradigm is an ever nearer possibility and is potentially incorporated, of course, within a debased existence. On the other hand, the proper truth of colonial wars of conquest and occupation, just as the proper truth of counter-insurrectional wars, is that they are always undergirded by a genocidal extermination impulse. Historically, such wars have always been justified by the supposed absence of a common bond of humanity between the colonizers and the colonized. This is the reason why their aim has usually been the total erasure of indigenous peoples' past, the annihilation of their collective memory, the destruction of the basic infrastructures thanks to which they sought to maintain a semblance of personhood. And where this exterminatory logic has not been pushed to its final consequences, various killing projects have taken shape, and complex strangulation tactics have been put in place with the view of intensifying the suffocating conditions enslaved, colonized, or racialized classes have been subjected to. No one has written so vividly about what I have tried to describe as Frantz Fanon. And one of the key effects of these strangulation tactics has often been to literally make the lives of these classes of people unlivable, and to take away their capacity to breathe. When one reads Fanon, for instance, it's extremely striking the extent to which he keeps coming back to the topos of breathing and the inability to breathe, which in some of the most recent, but in fact long traditions of receiving death, especially among black people in the New World, one of the last words they were called upon to utter was, "I cannot breathe." So historically, these strangulation tactics have mostly been experimented against black people. This was the case in the New World, and to a large extent in former settler colonies such as South Africa. The killing of a black person, I'm forced to say the killing of the black man in particular, because there were many different forms of killing a black man and killing a black woman. The killing of the black man, the black person being akin to the slaughter of an animal. So a molecular process, both spatially and temporally. These tactics have included the use of law enforcement, judicial, penal apparatuses, very often to confine racialized classes in carceral spaces, and the manufacturing of such social formations, mixing the racial and the carceral, in fact, has become a trademark of late colonial occupation. Indeed, racist violence, initially encapsulated in the figure of the black, has been gradually extended to people of color in general. The criminal and thuggish kernel constitutive of state power and state sovereignty has been periodically unleashed against them. And in disputed or occupied territories, it has often espoused the contours of a war on life itself, beginning with a war on motion, on the capacity to move. So contemporary forms of fracturing and fissuring, of draining and depletion, obey the same master code. And as I suggested in Critique of Black Reason, they are paving the way for the universalization of the black condition, or the becoming black of very large swathes of humanity. And this can be seen in contemporary ways of waging war against enemies whose living environments and conditions of survival are systematically destroyed, ruined by the use of armor-piercing uranium ammunition, banned weapons such as white phosphorus, and as a matter of fact, the destruction of enemy cities in the early years of the 21st century has been made possible thanks to intensive high and low altitude bombing of basic infrastructures, the cocktails of carcinogenic and radioactive chemicals that saturate the soil, fill the air, the toxic dust that rises from the rubble of razed cities, refugees camps, and by the pollution caused, of course, by hydrocarbon fires. So brutality has taken, of course, these spectacular forms, and all of these bombs, what they demonstrate is that they demonstrate ad absurdum an unheard of power of destruction. So the two books, Necropolitics and Brutalism, testify somewhat to this change of condition engendered by new forms of war, metabolism, as well as by contemporary transformations to the biosphere and technosphere. In the sense that we are now, more than ever before, surrounded by a constellation of technical beings. To inhabit the world today means to engage almost uninterruptedly with matter and with objects, and these objects are no longer a pure assemblage of matter. Some are now vested with intentions, and this integral participation in the life of objects means that contemporary humans live in relative co-naturality with technology. And this process, unprecedented in the shocks it is triggering, is planetary. In fact, we are transitioning not only to a new earthly dispensation, a new nomos of the earth, but also to new figures of the human itself. Which leads me then to suggest that we may be witnessing the almost definitive triumph of artifacts over what French paleontologist André Leroy-Gourand called speech. We are about to outsource to information machines and technologies of calculation the bulk of the faculties reason was supposed to care for. And this is happening, as I have just suggested. All kinds of killing projects are tried out on the most vulnerable classes of the world's population, in particular migrants, refugees, and stateless people. So this coming together of various forms of destruction, the destruction of the human body, the destruction of the body of the earth, this coming together of these various forms of destruction is what gives, at least for me, the concept of necropolitics its catastrophic weight. So let me now conclude. As I confessed at the beginning, 3 questions have haunted me over the last 3 decades and a half. These questions concern the future of life, the futures of reason, and the futures of the earth. Future of reason, as reason is transmogrifying gradually into techne. But techne is overtaking reason in its classical definition. In my case, these questions have found the highest point of condensation and articulation in this particular sign called Africa. I would like to return to this sign as a way of conclusion. As the age of Europe gradually comes to closure, many increasingly feel the need to reopen the archives of what Edouard Glissant called le tout monde, the archives of the world at large. Mindful of the fact that only a planetary library might provide us with the resources we need to confront the planetary challenges we now face, to enact a new figure of the in common. My task this afternoon was to convince you that as we look for other forms of exercising thought, Africa, in its dispersed, in its multifaceted faces, in its continental and diasporic depth, represents precisely one such archive. Now, to suggest that Africa, thus defined, might be one of those archives we must return to, might be taken as a mere provocation, especially for those who have long thought and may still think that the continent and its peoples represent a marginal zone of culture and human thought, bereft, as it supposedly is, of anything meaningful to the human adventure on Earth. And this certainly explains why, for so long, most discourses on Africa have relied upon negative definitions of the continent and its people, or on reasoning that always concerns a failure or absence. Absence of what, if not of what we ourselves know and know we possess. Yet, the wealth of the material we have accumulated on Africa is phenomenal. Over the last century and a half, we have made progress in terms of the study of rituals, myths, legends, cosmologies, iconographic technologies, sculptures, oral traditions, masks, ornaments, and even body painting. I'm not advocating a return to any putative authenticity, which in any case does not exist. I'm not even pleading for the rehabilitation of so-called indigenous knowledges or for any kind of nativist epistemology. We know very well to what kinds of political uses it might be put to. I'm not at all going in that direction. I would just like to say that in contradistinction to a tradition that has long seen the archives of so-called people without writing as relying on ephemeral records, we are now, thanks to the amount of knowledge we have accumulated on Africa, we are in a position to go beyond conventional concepts of text, conventional concepts of narrative. Atto was talking about it yesterday, conventional concepts of the archive. We are now in a position to, if you want, refigure the archive. In this project of refiguring the archive, I think one step is to be taken. We have to move away from the idea, long-held idea, that in Africa we are faced with traditions that are purely oral. We have to take seriously images and objects. The capacity of these traditions to have put together, both in ceremonial as in non-ceremonial context, the way in which they have called upon or instigated sounds and images. And this is probably the reason why in African traditions and cultures, memory was based on both images and artifacts, as well as on words. Images and objects did not only orient visual inference, they entertained an extremely close relationship to thought. So what you have been seeing on the screen are, of course, they look like objects, and they are objects. What you have been seeing on the screen are fragments of text, which testify to styles of thought. If we take those archives seriously, then we will understand why, in fact, humanity is objectively earthbound, in the sense that our main location has been the earth. Or to be specific, the surface of the earth by which I mean the solid structure beneath our feet. That structure on which we stand and which somewhat defines the fundamental place we all rely on, the fundamental place we all inhabit. If we take seriously this archive, this African archive in its multifaceted dimensions, then we will understand why it is that the ongoing climate disorder forces us to zoom in a bit more on this terrestrial ecology of our existence, to take more seriously than in the past this matter of our tenure on Earth. The African archive, in that sense, will help us, I am convinced, to see to what extent, indeed, our future on Earth will also be dependent on the future of democracy. A substantive form of democracy, a democracy to come, whose name we still have to invent. But a substantive form of democracy which maybe for the first time in the very history of democracy will be delinked from the tragic histories of necropolitics. Thank you very much for your attention.
On behalf of the Holberg board, I must say thank you very much, Professor Mbembe, for a truly wonderful lecture, which I'm confident will be inspiring to many, and myself included. I would also like to extend my gratitude to the audience here in the University Aula in Bergen, and those of you joining us online worldwide. Today's program of the Holberg Week has now concluded. However, I would like to remind everyone of the awards ceremony taking place here in this aula tomorrow at 1400. If you have not yet registered for this event, please visit the Holberg Prize website for more information. Thank you.